Good afternoon. Oh. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to this next in our series of symposia. My name is Mark Lukashevitz. I'm Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication. I want to welcome everybody and welcome especially our new president, Susan Poser, and Provost Janet Lanahan. We're delighted to have you here. Thank you. As you all know, the theme of this inaugural week for Dr. Poser is Hofstra University and our communities. And the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication is very dedicated to and invested in the idea of building relationships with communities. We are a communication school. We are about storytelling, about sharing narratives, themes, in a two-way dialogue with communities around the country, and particularly with communities here in Hempstead and around our campus. Just in the last few years, the Herbert School has launched a new news outlet for Hempstead, which is a bit of a news desert. Universities across the country have started playing that role where student journalists help reflect the communities within which they are situated to bring important stories to those communities. Our filmmakers, our public relations specialists, our journalists, our television specialists, our radio station, all are engaged in this activity. And what you're going to hear about today is a discussion of how important that is and how we can contribute to this community building that goes on here at Hofstra University. So every one of the faculty members on this stage today, led by Vice Dean Mario Murillo, are going to talk about some of the work they've done in the classroom and outside the classroom to build those relationships. And I look forward to that conversation. Mario?
Excellent. Thank you, Dean Luke. I want to thank Dean Luke for the 3 years plus of enthusiasm, creativity, energy that he has brought to the Herbert School, and it's been a great pleasure collaborating and being on your side these last 3 years in the school. And I also want to salute the new administration, of course, Dr. Susan Poser, our new president. Of course, we're really happy with the energy that's been, even in the short 2 months, I guess it's about 2 months now, and Janet as well, in terms of the provost office, interest and kind of enthusiasm for the academic programs. This symposium and the series that's been developed is a reflection of that, and it's really, speaking on behalf of all my colleagues, I think we're excited about that, so we thank you for that and your presence here today. I also want to thank all the people who organized the symposium. Big thank you. Obviously, it's a big lift, but Atheline Collins, we should give a special shout out. What a wonderful person. Always great to collaborate with Atheline Collins. The building, I'm going to try to be brief because I'm a faculty, university professor, but also a radio person, so I can be a windbag occasionally. So I'm going to try to be really brief in contextualizing this. Really, the idea of building and bridging our future together, Hofstra and our communities, as Dean Luke pointed out, is something that the Herbert School has been trying to do consistently for years. We had the High School Journalism Institute, which is run by a number of our faculty, but including Professor Brinton, the Documenting Diversity program, which was an ongoing series of video production workshops, also with students in local high schools, very diverse community, teaching them filmmaking, etc., but also understanding the importance of context and storytelling and the importance of diversity. Of course, we salute WRHU's ongoing work in the community, which not only involves covering the community on a daily basis, but also involving community partners at the radio station. I know Bruce Avery and the staff there are committed to that, and we at the Dean's Office are also committed to that, and hopefully to see that grow continuously. And then all the other many conferences and seminars and workshops that we've done at the school, engaging the community on all sorts of different issues and spaces, including in collaboration with the Center for Civic Engagement. I'm happy to say that at the Herbert School, two of us, Professor Kumar and myself, have had the pleasure of being the director of that in previous years. And it's a commitment to connecting community with the communication disciplines that we represent at the Herbert School. A lot of the work that we're going to focus in this panel, though, is really the classroom, right? Even though a lot of that is extracurricular work and you never really separate from the classroom, the big challenges that we have is how do we engage students to work in the community, collaborate in the community, but in the classroom space? Because we have the kind of our artificial limitations of 15-week semesters, and as all of you who've worked in media, who've worked in journalism, who've worked in some of these other filmmaking, documentary work, you don't necessarily develop relationships in 15 weeks, right? It takes a lot longer than that. You have to build them based on trust and mutual respect and connection, that where both the community and the producer, the creator, are engaged in a mutual dialogue. And that's the challenge, and that's what I hope we can kind of address today and see how some of the best practices in the classroom in terms of pedagogy, but also in terms of getting students to benefit from these. And also, how do we measure success, right? That's always the big challenge. How do we measure in terms of outcomes where we're making progress, where we're maybe not doing so well, and how we can strengthen some of those opportunities and some of those possibilities. And I just, there's two kinds of literacies that we're talking about. We're talking about civic literacy and media literacy. Both of them go hand in hand as far as I'm concerned. But the idea that when you're engaging students in going out to the community, getting to know local activists, getting to know local community organizations, engaging with public officials, engaging with the private sector, small business, etc., they're forced to connect directly in a human level and understand those dynamics, the many dynamics that those communities are facing, those sectors of the communities are facing. And there's a lot of literature on it in terms of how that kind of, in terms of communication, journalism, etc., that kind of engagement leads to civic literacy, leads to a lifelong commitment, if anything, to political participation, to politics, to all sorts of other things that too often we hear young folks are not interested, right? And that's not true. And I think the evidence is in all of the students that we've been working with, many of the students who have done tremendous work, many of whom we're still in touch with after 20 years or so, who are still doing incredible work in a variety of disciplines and fields. And a lot of it, we'd like to say, is directly connected to their connection with the work that was done here at Hofstra University. And then there's a media literacy. We know that there's a large sector of the population that doesn't trust anything in the media. And this trust has fractured our public sphere, has fractured the possibility of serious public discourse in a space of dialogue and deliberation. And a lot of it has to do with the commercial media, but also we also see the nefarious effects of kind of bad uses of social media, because social media gets always a bad rap when we know that there's a lot of good uses for social media. So how do you engage students to recognize that no, the media could play a constructive role? And there's a lot of interesting work that's being done in other campuses, other universities with schools of communication, where they're focusing on how you can build trust with local communities. And in fact, the more local, the more trust, really, than sometimes very often in terms of a national media, et cetera. So these are things that students in the process of producing films, stories, covering communities, they're learning and they're developing, and essentially it becomes the antidote to the misinformation and the false information that they're so often engaged with on social media and on mainstream media as well. It's not only social media does not have the exclusive franchise on disinformation. Let's put it that way. So that's what we're going to look at and see again with the panelists here. I think I'll throw it to them really, and we have it as a format more as a conversation. So pretend this is sort of like a radio show or a podcast that we're doing here. But it's a great pleasure. And really, from the Herbert School, we could have chosen probably at least a dozen people, probably more, who are engaged in this kind of work, whether it's research in the community, focusing on communication and media, whether it's filmmaking, whether it's journalism, whether it's documentary, et cetera, radio, no doubt. But I think we have a really nice set of folks here who are joining us today, and I'm really happy to be a part of this. So I'm just going to introduce them, and then we'll start off with the questions. I'm going to go here first to my right. Christine Nelskasey is an associate professor of radio, television, film. She's a writer, director, and producer of documentary and fictional films. Brooklyn Roses, her recent feature film, won Best Feature Documentary at the International Fic Auteur Festival in Mexico, the International Gulf of Naples Independent Film Festival in Italy, the Art of Brooklyn Film Festival right here in New York City. I'm just skimming the surface in terms of the ton of credits that she has in terms of filmmaking and documentary, et cetera. But one thing in common about much of her work is its roots in the communities that she has filmed and she has told stories about and stories with. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Christine. Next to Christine is a good friend and comrade for many years, also at the Radio, Television, Film Department, Professor Ashish Kumar, who's a professor of radio, television, and film. He's a filmmaker and documentarian who has also done several award-winning media projects that have strong community roots and orientations. But I don't mind publicly saying I'm most proud of what you're doing now, the work that you're continuing to do. It's an ongoing, innovative, groundbreaking project, an immersive web documentary on the South Asian American LGBTQ community. It's called Body, Home, and World. If you haven't heard about it, it's something you might want to Google after this session and check it out. And it's an ongoing project, which perhaps Ashish will talk a little bit about. So thank you, Ashish Kumar, for being with us. Next to Ashish is Ivan Cardona, who's an assistant professor of journalism, media studies, and public relations. He is the director of the graduate program in public relations at the Herbert School. So that's another tasky, heavy lift that he's been doing since he's joined us on the faculty. He's a senior level communication strategist with over 20 years of agency and C-suite management experience. He consults on strategic corporate communication, helping companies leverage new and existing relationships with communities and publics through media relations, media management, and media. And he's also been at the forefront of a number of the student organizations here at the Herbert School, the National Association of Black Journalists, National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and then the two PR organizations, the National Black Public Relations Society and the National Hispanic Public Relations Association, really getting those off the ground again on campus and in our school, doing tremendous work in there. So thank you for that as well, Yvonne. And then finally, last but not least, definitely not least, Scott Brinton, who's a special assistant professor of journalism, media studies, and public relations. He is the executive editor of the Long Island Advocate, the hyperlocal news site that Dean Luke referred to before, that we're very excited about and that we hopefully will continue to see grow and have an impact. Scott is the coordinator of Hofstra's Summer Journalism Institute, the one I referred to earlier, and he is the executive editor of Herald Community Newspapers, one of the largest community newspaper chains in the Northeast, essentially trying to counter this whole challenge and difficulty and problem of news deserts in local communities. So Scott Brinton knows a lot about some of this and directing students in that institution for a long time now. So thank you, Scott. So I going quickly along, I gave brief bios for all of you. I certainly did not do justice to all of your CVs. But I did want to start by getting you to talk a little bit about your professional background, your academic background, and how that work has informed your approach to working with students to engage in local communities. How does that work manifest itself in the classroom? Not sure who wants to start. Christine?
Well, the path that they started, so it was I was at the graduate program organized by Howard Zinn at Goddard College, with social change, and I wanted to make film that changed the representation of working class women in the media. It's the Edith Bunker days, so it was a pretty bad representation. So I was very interested in that. It was part of my thesis. And so I came back to New York, which I knew, and started looking for these women to work with. And most of the films that had done about working class women were historical, but I wanted to do something that was happening now. I wanted to show women who were activists and not just passive Edith Bunkers, and who had really changed their lives to save their communities. So I did a lot of research, looked at newspapers, and I found this community in Brooklyn, which is now completely gentrified, very different than when I started, which was Williamsburg and the North Side. And there was a lot of demonstrations that were shown on local television, and I went to investigate the community. Well, I can't tell you how much I learned being a part of that. My first experience there was, oh no, I come from a working class background, but this community is ugly, it's depressed, it's sad, it's everything. Poor people in this community, it's not like at all like Carroll Gardens where the houses are nice. And it was the first time I had to actually change my own perceptions about, like, am I the elitist all of a sudden in this community? And it was really interesting to me because all the articles, there are a lot of journalist articles and a lot of scholarly articles on the community portrayed it as this really unhappy place, a place where there were a lot of victims and oppressed people. But when I started working there, my first experience there was being invited to a community meeting in the funeral parlor by the funeral parlor directors are very often community activists in these small neighborhoods. And I started realizing that these people, everybody in this community loved their neighborhood. They had an entirely different view than even I had, thinking of myself as a sensitive person in terms of understanding neighborhoods and class. They adored it. They thought I lived in an ugly place in Soho. They loved the trees. There were gardens being developed in the housing projects by women in the housing projects. People felt their children were safe in the community, and they were all active to save the community from being it was a planned shrinkage issues and redlining issues at that time, and they were active because they felt that home in their life and their community, and they had nothing bad to say about it. So it really gave me an introduction in how do you portray a community? How do you represent a community? And it was so wonderful. And one of the great things about being in that community is that I really learned how visual production value and visual photographing and technology and the aesthetics of making a film are so important to presenting a community dynamics and showing people in a way that people that saw one of my films showed their children showed their mothers at their funerals because they loved it so much. So that was the first thing, the relationship between aesthetic principles and filmmaking and representation in a community of who you're seeing, and and looking at the community from their point of view.
Excellent. I'm sure your students value that considerably over the years. Ashish, do you want to give it a shot, Professor Kumar?
Sure. So my pathway to doing this type of community-based or community-originated work began as a somewhat more of an intellectual question in grad school. I had come from India as a graduate student, having studied sociology at the undergraduate and graduate level, when I decided to study media. And one of the questions that I was interested in at the time was, is there a universal language of film? Is there a universal language of cinema? Or are there alternatives to that? And that question sort of began with this very large kind of body of work that made me discover communities that were using media in ways that were very plastic, that were very connected with their material life, that were very connected with their texts that they were using in their community, that were not, obviously, were largely ignored with larger bodies of filmmaking, what we refer to as national cinemas. So the discovery of how communities tell their own story, the way that they choose their surroundings, the way they choose representation of who speaks and how they speak, and how they discuss what gets shown, was really educational for me as a filmmaker. So how does a filmmaker take part in this? Well, there are two kind of divides in this. We filmmakers usually belong in privileged community where we have access to production equipment. We might belong to universities where we can write and research, have the privilege of time. And there are communities around us, for instance, in Hofstra, where similar voices and similar stories need to be told. This coming together of a very privileged space where there is a desire and there is a resource to do so, and communities that have the knowledge, the grassroots information of whose story to tell, how to tell it, that marriage to me was very.
I want to get to that later, because how do you explore that again, as I said before, in a semester where students have to turn this around and get a grade on it. But that's an important history there. Ivan Cardona, your reflections on how you bring it to the classroom.
I guess my love around media communication and public relations came from being very little. I was raised in the media environment. My father was one of the most prominent professors at the University of Puerto Rico. School of Communications. So I was raised along all these wonderful generation after generation of broadcasters and journalists and famous media people in outlets like Telemundo and Univision. So I saw how important this media was to the community, especially because these outlets talk to a community that it was hard to reach, people in the United States that were of Hispanic descent. So I understood early on that that media representation was a representation of life, of people and society and communities, especially community values. Therefore, it's important to me and my courses, and I see a lot of familiar faces here from my students, which I welcome, that to address media as a very powerful tool whose purpose is social and communal representation and collective understanding. This is all embedded, obviously, in a communication, it's a mediated communication. From a public relations perspective, which is my field, community becomes the defining foundation of our strategy. Community frames our message. In other words, much like we learned in the theory of communications, which we were all familiar with, sender, channel, and receiver, when society and community delimits complex variables that ensure that the message is not only received, but understood. So the message and the way that is framed, it holds value. It holds community references. It makes sense to those people that live in those communities. That is why it's so important that we understand that community and community referencing is one of the pillars of our communication responsibility. Community provides a connecting tissue for that message.
Thank you, Ivan. Scott, Professor Brinton.
Yeah,
your thoughts on
sure.
that?
Hey, everybody. So in terms of journalism, I would say I belong to the Gravedigger School of Journalism. And there was a writer, a great writer, and I see Peter Goodman back there, and I'm sure he knows what I'm talking about here. But Jimmy Breslin, he in 1963 covered Kennedy's assassination, and rather than go cover the funeral, he went and covered the Gravedigger and wrote this amazingly beautiful column about the Gravedigger. And the whole concept behind Gravedigger journalism is this, is that you're going to go and report on the underreported or the unreported stories out there. So as a community journalist, which I've always been, I've always thought of myself as a community journalist. My objective has always been to tell the stories that nobody else is telling. That goes back to, I made that decision as a final decision back, I would say, probably mid-1990s at a Press Association conference, New York Press Association in Albany. There was a professor there named Jacques Lauderer, and he came and gave this beautiful presentation about Appalachia, and he was covering the people of Appalachia. And I just thought, that's what I want to do. I want to cover people that nobody else is paying attention to. In a word, that's who I am as a journalist. That's who I am as a community journalist. And I think that's what community journalists do. They cover the underreported and unreported stories out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's reflected in a lot of the work that I've done, and I feel the same way. So now I'm going to get the tough questions in here. How do you do that and explain that through pedagogy, through in the classroom to students? And let's be clear. A lot of students come to the Herbert School and they look at the bells and whistles. A lot of them want to be, famous TV anchors. They want to do sports reporting, which, no problem with that. I love it as well. But sometimes it's not so easy to sell them on this idea of doing work in the community, right? So maybe I'll ask you, Ashish, and we'll bounce back and forth. Some strategies you may use to engage students who perhaps otherwise wouldn't be thinking in terms of community engagement through their media work, and get them to, be very enthusiastic about it.
Sure. So the mode through which in the television area and in the RTVF part, we started a course called Media Action Project, which basically partnered student producers who were seniors, who had pretty much adequate training to shoot, edit, tell stories, to tell the story of someone else and share the authorship of the story. That's not an easy process. Every single one of us, whether it's film or journalism or PR, believe in, we are the center of the universe. How do you displace that? Through that class, the first question that we begin with is the question of voice and representation. And I asked students to explore if they think they have been misrepresented or their representation in media is distorted in some way. And without doubt, every single one of them writes oodles and oodles of things that they have been misrepresented about, whether they are white or whether they're teenagers, whether they belong to a certain ethnic. And so then we get delved into the question of how do we start to unpack the question? Where do we go to provide alternative representation? And that brings us to the question of working in spaces where those representations live, where people are, whose lived experiences we can document. And that becomes a dialogue between mainstream representation. They begin questioning and their attempt to authenticate lived experience by partners. And that's one mode that we, obviously we can delve into the questions of exactly how that works out in the course of a semester, what those partnerships entail, what type of ground the students have to give up in order to gain new learning. I think that's powerful.
But it is media. What you're describing is one example of what media literacy means, right? Understanding more closely the communities that they're covering or they're reporting out or telling stories about, and understanding the way in mainstream channels they're being misrepresented or otherwise. So
I think it's important to add what Mario, you said earlier on, that these relationships are not formed by simply picking up the phone and saying, hey, we want to make something. Are you interested? They're community-based organizations are very astute. They have not been doing this to encounter, fly-by-night operators who want to offer something. They want to know if there is going to be reciprocity in this relationship.
Right.
They want to know what work the institution has done to deepen its relationship. And so what I bring is, obviously the work that I have done, and I benefit largely from participating in institutions like the Center for Civic Engagement,
right.
in doing the kind of work that has connected Hofstra to its environment. I always love, this Frank Lloyd Wright's quote about how a house should not be on the hill. It should be off the hill. House and hill should be belonging to one another. And so I always saw our institution as this having porous boundaries with the communities around us, which attracted me to projects like the Center for Civic Engagement,
Absolutely.
through which those relationships. That's important.
So sticking to these ideas, one argument I always give to my students, or I get them to take out of their head, because sometimes I hear them say, yeah, I want to give a voice to the voiceless. And I say, no, take that off, delete that from your mind. That's not what you're doing. You're laughing, Christine, but your approach to explaining otherwise to your students?
I think that I've sort of told them that it won't work if they choose to do a documentary without having the full participation of the people in the documentary. I mean, documentaries are conversations between people. They're not interrogations. The series POV is one of the biggest national series on PBS, is point of view. Documentaries are people that make films that have a point of view. And so I asked them to engage right away, not only with their point of view, but to interact with the point of view of the people that they're working with, and see what the differences are and what the people want to say. So it's not, I would say, giving a voice to the voiceless. It's shutting your mouth and letting people speak. And you find that they'll have a lot to say if you give them the space and make them feel comfortable in your environment and want to hear what they have to say, and take care of how you're photographing them so that they feel that they're being taken care of physically. They're putting themselves on the line. So I think that's very important. And I also think the personal is political. And very often, I think that the intimacy developed between the filmmaker and the persons you're filming is really key. And it could be like something that I mean, I've made documentaries that happen over 6 months and documentaries that happen over 5 years. And I still, hopefully, even though they were smaller subject matters, was able to develop an intimacy between the subjects and the other people. So I don't look at them as them, the voiceless, and me, the other person. I think that's sort of an elitist attitude. And so that's what I try to do. I try to have the interaction between the people. And also, when you're seeking a community, it's really good. And I think Ashish mentioned this before. And
Speak to the mic, Christine.
Ashish mentioned it before. Basically, you are going to go into that community and you're going to try to find the leadership in that community to introduce you to the people who will want to give their point of view. And they're often the community leaders themselves. You're not looking for the shyest person in the community who doesn't participate in anything. You're looking for the person who actively participates in things so that they have something to say about that and they're engaged and they're passionate. So that is very important to looking for the leadership, but it's also one thing that can happen. I've noticed a lot of filmmakers will go and have, I would call them the white leader, the white hero that's saving the community, instead of going and getting the people that they're helping in the community or the people that have been empowered by their actions and focusing on them. They just think of focusing on the organizer rather than the people in the community itself. And that is something that has to be addressed.
Absolutely. Now, naturally, we're dealing with several different disciplines that have completely different goals and objectives. So it's kind of hard to clump them all in together. Public relations and journalism, even those two are seen in some worlds as total polar opposites. Talking about filmmaking, documentary. We also have a big film program where narrative fiction is being created, which has a whole other sense of issues that we can talk about. But I wanted to get Yvonne and Scott to pipe in on this idea of how do you convey this to students when, especially when, let's say, journalism, it's not easy to get trust. I mean, as I said before, there's considerable amounts of skepticism and distrust on the part of the community vis-a-vis media. And then especially if you start talking about student media, you know, who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you knocking on my door? How do you convey that to students to get them to think through that?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing and the most important thing is that they're outside the classroom, that we kick them outside the classroom as soon as we can and out into the community. So we do that, for example, in the advanced reporting class that I'm teaching and that I've taught. The first 6 weeks is straight, go out, cover meetings, get out there, be out there with the people, go and talk to people. Talk to the person at the back of the room. Don't talk to the people at the front of the room necessarily. Again, look for that underreported or unreported story. And after that first initial 6 or 7 weeks of meetings, we then engage in a 6 week to 7 week long investigative team effort to cover a single issue. And they have to go out and they have to be in the community. I had one girl, for example, we did opioids 2 years ago as a major issue, and she went and took 2 classes in Narcan, which is a drug basically that counteracts an overdose. So she was out there and she really developed relations. We talk about developing relations, not relationships per se, but relations. She was able to develop relations with the folks who the EMTs were holding this. And through those EMTs, she was able to then gain the trust of various addicts. And she spoke to 3 or 4 addicts. And we wound up publishing 2 of those addicts. So it really, you can do it within a very short period of time. It's not easy. But we talk about how to do that during our classes, how to gain trust, how to work through sources. But most important, you have to be out there. The only other thing I would mention real quick, because I know we're each under time constraint here, but environmental reporting, which I've taught in the past, is a wonderful class. The very first thing I let students know is that we will be in the wetlands south of here, south of Freeport, south of Merrick, and we will be in the water, on the water, in the muck, in the mud, and you'll be picking up garbage. And that's a part of the class, because if you want to understand an environmental threat, you have to actually go and see it and experience it. And through that, we have a partnership with the Freeport Splash, Stop Polluting, Littering, and Save Harbors, which is a very large South Shore environmental organization. And we partner with them to get our students on boats and out to the mudflats. And they very happily take us out there to assist with the cleanups. And through that process, they meet the folks who are doing the cleanups, and the folks who are part of the environmental organization see that our students are engaged. They want to help. They're helping, and so they very quickly become sources for stories that they're working on.
Professor Cardona, you want to add something to that? Again, a completely different discipline, but still engaging the community.
Yeah, of course. And my tactic is referencing identity and understanding community self, a sense of self. Who are we as a community? And I start my classes asking a very question. This is not a simple task. We live in a land of immigrants. So unless your parents were Native Americans, your descendants are probably coming from somewhere else. So imagine the challenges that we have every day dealing with the topic of diversity. On top of that, we live in Long Island, one of the most diversified places in the world. So who we are, if who we are, that definition is the connecting tissue between communities and the way that they understand the references, the way that they feel engaged, identified with the topics and the messages. Imagining what our first thing that we need to do is kind of like engage that community and understand that community's messages and values. In my courses, it's all about local communities. And using my campaign classes as an example, it starts months before the class starts by choosing organizations in the community that are important to the community that we can use and help. This is the way that Hofstra outreaches to the community. So thinking of our past clients like the Viscardi Center and education for children with disabilities, thinking of ACLD and helping employment for people with disabilities. I'm thinking of Rock and Roll, which is a Long Island food bank, and how we help them. Feel Good Foundation, an organization that helps fallen representatives and first responders and how they help with families. So if you think about it, these organizations represent community challenges. These are exactly organizations that are there to tailor or to help with community needs and how we tackle those challenges together. So these services start by owning that social responsibilities that these organizations have adopted for many years, and our students need to understand what is going on with those organizations, those challenges, that community before we can even start our campaigns.
So I'm looking at the clock, and I'm always concerned about going over limit, and I don't want to not point out the success stories. And I know we have a few students who've come in, and I also wanted to address the things that haven't worked out so well, right? Because sometimes you fall flat, and sometimes it could be pretty problematic what happens as a result of these community engagement initiatives that don't necessarily work out. Talk about those in a second, but let's maybe if we could focus on some concrete examples, even in the more recent past, in which you see the work, the thinking behind it really pay dividends, not only for the student and in the classroom, but for the community organization or the institution that was being engaged with. Christine, if you want to take a shot at that.
I think I would like to refer to the graduate program, because that had a very global community perspective, and students shot films in Africa, in Oaxaca, in Panama, and in millions of other places about people that they were not even familiar with, that they didn't even speak the language in certain cases. And the emphasis, and a lot of those films, the problem was the white savior, the head person. And I think that all of those students, when confronted with that reality, that was what they were doing, changed their philosophy immediately. It was sort of amazing. It was shocking to them. They didn't know that they were even doing such a thing of not representing the people in the community. And if we looked at those films now, we would see that they're full of the voices of the people that they were talking about, and they eliminated this whole leadership position. And I think that was a success, very successful. It was one of the most successful things I've ever been involved in. I really thought that was great fun.
For those of you who don't know, we used to have an MFA program in documentary studies and production in the RTVF department at the Herbert School, and I guess it's on ice for the next who knows how long.
And if we talk about success, all of those people have gotten their PhD. They're head of.
There's a lot of wonderful people that came through that.
They're wonderful people and gotten scholarships and grants from the Jerome Foundation, et cetera, those films.
Professor Kumar, you want to give it a shot and give us some examples?
Sure. So it's been approximately 10 or 15 years since we have been teaching the media action projects course between my colleague Doug Morrow and I. And over the course of these years, we have worked with, I would say, between 60 to 80 Long Island-based organizations and produced that many short films that have been used in a range of situations. It can be policy, advocacy, recruitment, membership drives. It all depends on what the community partner is looking for, what is their end goal, and how they want to shape the project, how they want to shape the campaign. In fact, one of our community partners, and if you talk about success, I always think it's amazing when a community partner returns to you and that relationship gets renewed because they have been through that path of working in a very intense semester-long environment, how quickly things have to move. And I actually want to just give a shout out to Serena, who I know is sitting in the back. So Serena's organization has done amazing work to rehabilitate formerly incarcerated women and their families. She heads an organization called New Hour for Women and Children of Long Island. My students worked at least twice that I'm aware of. And the last time that we worked with Serena was during the COVID pandemic, when things were headed to a very dark place for everyone. And yet we found that space to communicate and to find out a way that those stories, that those campaigns that were vitally needed, in fact, in extreme circumstances, we all heard about what was happening in jails and prisons across New York during COVID time. They were doing some amazing advocacy work around that issue. And so we became part of that story, and it became a point for students to sort of have some traction on the pandemic, have a point of reference that they could say that this is not all lose-lose. There are things that we are doing right now that are contributing. And later on we'll get a chance to see some of the student work, but I would say that was a very empowering situation for the students, and I hope for the organization.
I'm not sure if maybe in a moment you want to say a few words, or I'm not sure.
Sure.
If you can come to the
There's a
microphone here,
microphone,
forgive me for forcing you out of your chair. And we are going to try to take a few folks. There's some students as well here who are going to talk a little bit about the work that they've done as well in these classes.
It's great to be here with all of you. I'm Serena, the ED over at New Hour. And the interesting thing about working with the students in terms of two projects, you can check it out on our website, newhourli.org, and you can see the video that they created. But the most powerful thing about working with the students was that they were feeling the effects of the pandemic. And because we had moved to virtual, they were really struggling with how we all were. And in fact, they were able to relate so closely to those of us who had been incarcerated, Latinx and Black and brown women across Long Island. And they were able to make that connection with them and their stories, and even see their own vulnerability reflected in the stories of the women who were living in cells 23 and a half hours a day with very little access to information. And for our women who were coming home from prison and jail during the pandemic, it was a powerful moment for them to realize that their experience was valued and that these students were able to bring their stories to life. So Professor Kumar, we are so grateful, and we love partnering and want to continue.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. Yvonne, you want to share some, best examples?
Well, it's funny because obviously through PR we don't talk. We use different channels. We use earned media and owned media and paid media to communicate, to have these exchanges and have these communications. So our content is a little bit different, but I taking a page out of our capstone course. One of the first things we did when we engaged Rock and Roll, which is a food bank here in the island, is go to the community and see them firsthand, the people that they were helping and the how they were distributing food amongst so many food banks in the Long Island area. And they were very proactive. They were picking up food from restaurants and grocery stores and bringing them into this centered operations that was then distributed, and the students actually helped in that process. So going through that experience, they decided to have a concert, and it was very interesting in the middle of a pandemic, having three major bands put up a concert to raise funds for a local Long Island entity. And I see those capstone students running around in the news hub at the Lawrence Herbert School Comm. You would never guessed it, that they were putting up a big show. And at the end of the show, I remember we finished the show with enough money to cover a full year of the expenses for Rock and Roll. And because it's in social media and because it's still going on, today, a couple of semesters later, it has tripled. So it continues to do social good. So it's
Rock and roll. Great. And Professor Brinton, I know you have a number of examples, and you can just go to the Long Island Advocate just to see some examples that are literally being churned out almost every day on the news site.
Yeah, well, I mean, first I have to thank Mark and Mario both for their vision for the Long Island Advocate, because I guess it was maybe 6 or 7 months after Mark had started as our dean. He asked me would I be interested in doing this project, and he had a vision for our students that they would be covering the local communities, particularly the news deserts that Mario mentioned before. And ever since then, we've been off and running. We got it going. It's a Medium site. We're hoping to move it into a WordPress site and make it more dynamic. Mario's been a great support over the past 2.5 years. He and I talk constantly. And the greatest part about it for me is seeing the students go through the process of publication, move through the various steps, and then get their work actually published on what is a real news site, an excellent news site. And we market it as a site for some of the best reporting here at the Herbert School. We have great examples. So we have 2 students here, Molly Ramirez and Madeline Armstrong, and they both published like crazy last year. I'm looking forward to what both of them are going to produce this year. But they've done some really amazing work. So they're going to talk a little bit about their own work a little bit later, and we're going to show some examples. So I don't want to steal their thunder, but just trust me when I say that the level of reporting is such that it's as good as any professional publication. So that's been just a wonderful experience working through that and working with the students over the past couple of years. Last spring, I taught magazine reporting for the first time. So we have like an example of the magazine that we produce. We actually produce a physical magazine by the end of the semester. We were able to publish all of those students' works on the Long Island Advocate. So yeah, I've got other examples, but I don't want to take up tons of time.
Well, maybe they want to talk in this
Yeah.
moment. 'Cause unfortunately, the way this room is set up, we're going to, at the end, as we wrap up here, in terms of words, we're going to lower the screen and we'll show a few of those examples visually so you can get a sense of that. And so that'll be after
Yeah,
the
I'd
fact.
love for these guys
So
to...
maybe the 2 of you want to take the mic and talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing with the Advocate.
Hi, so I'm Madeline. I took Professor Brinton's online journalism class last semester, and we learned a lot about getting involved with different communities. So I think the one he's showing was a piece I wrote on Lake Agawam, which was suffering from toxic algae. So I kind of got into a lot of environmental reporting, which I think is fun. And so the Stony Brook Labs and the Department of Environmental Conservation were doing this new experimental treatment to try to get rid of the algae. So I got to do a lot of research on that and talk to different professionals and the mayor. And it's really exciting to learn about things that, like Professor Brinton said, are underreported or not being reported, because it affects a lot of people in these communities. And there's nothing like doing all this work and talking to these people and then having it published and having people read it and go, oh, I didn't know about this.
Excellent.
I'm Damali. So I also got involved in advocate when I took course of advanced news reporting class. And I tend to cover more of racial and social injustice issues. I'm an online advocate mostly because I also live in Hempstead. So I quickly became aware of what was going on in the community and how it wasn't being reported. But then I found this campaign called the Fund Excluded Workers. When I say fund excluded, I mean like undocumented immigrants that did not qualify for federal aid throughout the COVID pandemic. And, you know, these communities were predominantly Black and Hispanic, and they, because of their immigration status, were not having, you know, money to feed their families, and they were heavily relying on food banks and relying on the churches and their families to pull them out of the crisis that they were going through. So I followed that campaign for over a year. Just recently, they passed the $1 trillion fund for them, but you know it's still an issue because there's a lack of access getting the fund because the language barrier. On Long Island, there's only 6 organizations that are helping immigrants file the applications. And yeah, that was my experience as an advocate.
Yeah, excellent work, absolutely. Both examples. And I'm going to put Damali, get her embarrassed a little because I'm really pleased that she's taking a radio feature reporting and podcast class with me this semester. And the idea that she came up with is a story about a farm out in Riverhead run by Latino undocumented immigrants who run the farm, and they're in the process of saving the money, developing the resources to buy the farm and tell those stories. And so she's working on telling those stories, and I'm looking forward to seeing how and hearing how that piece comes out. So I'm really happy to have Damali in the class doing that. Well, okay, we have about maybe 12 minutes or so before we have to jump to the video and kind of get out of here, because I think it's 2:25 is when we're done. 2:15? Okay, well, maybe we'll do it quick. 2:25, okay, so quick in terms of measuring outcomes. I mean, sort of we're talking informally about outcomes that seem very positive, but obviously there are ways to see how these impact not only the community but the students as well. What are your suggestions? What are some best practices in doing that to sustain these projects in the long run? Anybody want to take on that in terms of how do we measure what we're doing is effective and is working, and perhaps ways to fix it if it's not?
Well, I can address that from my point as a journalist and as an editor. I'm always thinking in terms of publication. How can I get my students published? And again, I go back to the Long Island Advocate, great project. I go back to the Pulse, great project. So in terms of measuring my own success, or rather the success of the program, I'm looking at, are my students publishing? And what are they publishing when they are publishing? You know, when you talk about a series of stories that Damali's doing on excluded workers, and it's a year-long project, and she was, by the way, among the very first reporters to report on the story. You know, it's been reported since then, but she was out in the forefront because she was in the community. She reported that underreported story, and I have to believe it had an effect. It certainly had an effect on the organization, because suddenly there was an organization that had a voice. And so for me, it definitely boils down to publication.
Mm-hmm. Yvonne?
Well, best practices, for me has been allowing the students to understand the role and the responsibilities. And just that example that I gave before, one of the things I'm literally seeing these young professionals go out of the way to make a very successful campaign. And the reason is that they understood the responsibilities that they held, not only for the client, but also for Long Island and people that were in a very, position of disadvantage. I think that it is essential for our, you know, teaching methods and engaging strategies in the classroom to allow our students to understand the bigger scope. I tell my students, this is what you signed up for. This is what you want to do for the rest of your life. And this is a place where you learn to do it. But it's more than that, right? It's a place where you can really make a difference. Now in PR, we're blessed that we have a lot of digital tools that we can measure engagement and people sharing and people, the way that people are engaging a campaign. We can even do research post-campaign to find out how the perception of that organization grew. Maybe there were more people engaged, there were more people that know about it and are getting help. And that's a very satisfying feeling for us and for the students as well, especially if they own it early on and they understand they're part of the collective experience.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kumar?
So the dynamics of working in a class like that are huge. There's the logistics part of it, and then you say, well, if you get to the end, that's outcome assessment that you finished. But I think I understand that we're talking about both long-term life skills kind of issues that are hard to assess, but there are transformative things happening in the course of the semester. So many of them are connecting the dots. So we did a project on the environment, a student from California who had just spent summer rationing their water supply for showers. And so they are able to connect the fact that this is a global issue. There are students, we did a project with UCLT, Uniondale Community Land Trust, which is working to take ownership of zombie homes in our area, fix them up and bring them back into the community on a 99-year lease so that there's stability of housing in our area. Students from upstate New York connected with that issue of foreclosures in their community. So I think those kinds of transformative reflections I try to capture towards the end of the semester when they write a reflection essay, and to talk about the real granular things that they were able to observe in Long Island, up close, where they encounter issues of adult illiteracy or gang violence in our neighborhood. But they do that from the point of view of people who have ownership and are doing things to transform and are taking pride in their communities, instead of the classic representation problem, journalistic, sometimes documentary filmmaking, where we think of these as blighted, think of them as headline-worthy, sensationalistic stories.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's a lot of room for that kind of research. I'll mention in a second. Christine.
Yeah, I have a little different perspective because I'm not teaching a class directly related to community outreach, but I could just talk about the development of the students that have left here and the success of their films at film festivals, and that they're I remember one student who is now received 2 Jerome Grant Awards. When I first started shooting something, she was shooting up and people were on a sofa and it was ugly and it was just she wasn't really representing even her own family very, very well. And now the student Stephanie Santage is an extremely excellent cinematographer. She received 2 Jerome Foundation grants, and she's the head of the Negress Society, which has been sponsored by the Museum of Modern Art. So to me, and she's still doing beautiful films about community. They were films on Haiti. But to see her development as an artist was just phenomenal from my point of view. And I wouldn't say that she was the only one whose development as an artist I saw. I mean, we do present, we have a studies program. Ours is also a studies program, and showing students classic documentaries help them develop their own voice. And as we see them leaving the school, their voices are extremely sophisticated and wonderful, and yet have a very political, community-oriented focus. So that's really exciting for me.
Thank you, Christine. I think there's a lot of examples of people that we're still in touch with. I mean, hard to believe I've been teaching here. I'm now my 24th year at Hofstra, and I'm still in touch with folks from way back in my early days here, and you can see the work they're doing. And one would hope that at least a little bit, maybe un granito de arroz, as they say, a little grain of what I left them or the school left them, had an impact in the trajectory that they've taken since in terms of the work that they're doing in the community, doing in terms of communication, et cetera. But it is room for research, right? Doing longitudinal studies on how some of these work, how some of these students engaging in this kind of work, you know, in terms of their career trajectories. So I know when I was co-director of CCE with Greg Maney, we had talked about doing that, Center for Civic Engagement, looking at measuring how the students who were fellows, who were working with us in the community and here on campus, how that work impacted their long-term development in their career. We never did it, but it's something that perhaps we can think about ways of figuring out how to do that in the future, because it's definitely worth pursuing. We have a little bit of time maybe for one or two questions. I also see some of our great colleagues from the school. Maybe we're missing something that you might want to pipe in, faculty, students, or otherwise. Otherwise, we can maybe go to the videotape. Anybody have any thoughts or questions or comments on this discussion? Maybe not. Okay, so we'll go to the video. What I wanted to do is maybe if those of you who have queued something up, maybe a quick brief description of what we're going to look at, and then we're going to basically say thank you, because we're going to vacate this table, lower the screen, and then to close out the session, we'll watch these video clips representative of some of the work that we've been discussing. So Scott, you want to introduce what we're about to see?
We'll show the piece that Madeline had referenced earlier on Like Agawam. I get it right? Okay. This is out in Southampton, and last semester we were actually experimenting with Zoom interviewing. So the students all have to, this is online journalism, so they have to create multimedia packages where they give text, they give photos, they give video, they give graphics, and Madeline just put together, you know, to use a baseball metaphor, she just really hit a home run with it, where she had all the elements line up, multiple videos. She really went beyond what the curriculum called for, that she provided multiple videos. But to me, it's great. I mean, she's interviewing the mayor of Southampton, and I'm thinking, here's a 19-year-old student journalist, and here she is giving this great interview with the mayor of Southampton. So that's what.
Okay, and then again, we're going to show them all back to back once we briefly introduce them here. Yvonne?
Well, I have my example is from my research class, and it was a video from a student, and she was struggling to kind of like find out what to research, and well, I said, you know, basically you're somebody from Long Island, you're a student with a certain identity, and why don't you study that? You know, what can you really find out about your life as a professional and the challenges that you're gonna encounter professionally as you move forward. So this was a very in-depth research on her identity as well as what she represents in the industry.
Ashish.
And I have selections from 7 or 8 community-based organizations, campaigns that students put together over the course of last few years. They'll speak for themselves, but they cover issues ranging from domestic violence to healthy food choices in communities that have food deserts in them, to local histories in the Uniondale area.
Okay, well, I want to thank you all for those thoughts and interjections and experiences. We're going to lower the screen. I'm not sure how to do that. I probably should know, but you'll take good care, and then we'll watch some of the clips that we just talked about. We're not saying goodbye yet, because we're going to see that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madeline. And it's a multimedia package. This is what our site looks like. Her story was on Lake Agawam, which I mentioned was out in Southampton. It's a great story. I would encourage all of you to read it. Very important story for Long Island. It's a fascinating story if you're into environmental journalism and if you're just into the environment itself. Part of what they had to do was take a look at social media. So they definitely looked at social media and include those types of links with their story. So she referenced here Twitter. So there are multiple Twitter posts that she used. She also created wonderful graphics with the story. That's another requirement. And here's the video that we mentioned before. And I just want to play like 2 minutes of it, of her asking 1 or 2 questions and hear the mayor's response, because again, I'm just astounded partially as a professor, because here she has the confidence to actually sit down and do a video with the mayor of Southampton, which I just thought was terrific. So I can play that for like a minute. It's like a 7-minute. Wait. Okay. Yep.
So why is it? I'm Madeline Armstrong.
I'm good. How are you?
Why?
Well, toxic algae are not a problem, but they're really a problem, a growing problem across. And toxic algae formed due to a number of that get into due to largely stemming from nitrogen and phosphorus. And some of these come from outdated septic systems, road runoff, pesticides, certain fertilizers, and then harmful algae occur and the central nervous system, where that's worse, not great ecosystem because they consume much of the oxygen. Also have resulted fish kills in Lake Agawam. 2000 and the worst for toxic algae pilot.
Colleagues have like get the idea that it's did a lot of
Choice for All and our mission is to collectively solve issues that adversely affect the well-being of children and families across Long Island, New York, and beyond.
We found there are 33 delis in Roosevelt that individuals in Roosevelt frequent for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We also found that there's a high rate of obesity within the middle school and high school.
From before, I would visit delis like these, and they wouldn't have the healthy food options, or they would promote the chips and things like that first before they would promote any fruits or vegetables.
I want the young people of our communities that work hard, obtain an education, improve themselves exemplary, to be afforded the same opportunities as every other young adult in Nassau County.
Will always be evolving. The constant will be block. Block will be there as the community grows and realizes its potential and its vision.
The first behaviors that I noticed in him that stood out were controlling, extremely controlling of every aspect of me, every aspect, down to setting up my password for my computer or my phone, or just very controlling.
Strong is struggling to reunite our new generation, and that's really what we're doing. We're a gang prevention intervention program where we're saving the lives of youth by reaching out to them and offering opportunities.
When I came into Strong, it was an amazing feeling because it was like an accepting. They accepted you, they brought you in, they gave you love, and it opened my eyes up to other things. How to live in community, how to help each other, how to support one another. They prepared me for life.
The mission of Girls Inc. is to empower all girls to be strong, smart, and bold. We empower them to break through the barriers of society.
Strong, smart, and bold.
Especially in the communities where they don't have many resources.
Strong, smart, and bold.
We deliver hands-on programming.
It always strikes me that women who walk through our doors, they have really simple needs. Hey, I need a bus pass. I need to make it to a program. I need a letter for my judge so I can see my children. And it's amazing that we're able to give them these small things that ensure their success.
Most people have the money to buy a tube of toothpaste, but coming out of prison, that is a luxury.
This is my new hour. This is my new hour. This is my new hour.
This is my new hour.
This is my new hour.
The purpose of this research project is to primarily assess the opinions of young millennials in the field of communications on diversifying the entertainment media industry. In this study, I hope to gain a deeper insight as to what the upcoming generation of media professionals think about the term diversification and how it is being applied to the media forefront. The research study in question aims to evaluate the following notions. What are the opinions of college-age millennials on diversifying the Hollywood entertainment industry? How, by today's standards, is the general professional media population handling the call for equality both on and off screen? Are the strides that certain entertainment media collectives taking to be more inclusive in their rewarding and recognizing systems effective? How does the industry create a more diverse environment without tokenizing individuals or coming off as performative? How are college-age millennials handling the workplace environments in the media industry? And are race relations and prejudice still prevalent even in the more progressive 2021? To tackle my selected questions and overall purpose of this research project, I'll be conducting a series of 3 methodologies surrounding my target demographic of college-age millennials. These methodologies, the in-depth survey, focus group, and observational research, will be discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the entertainment media industry, ranging from television talent and personnel, to Hollywood, to independent films, to how it is handled in media educational facilities. As a multiracial woman of color looking to make a career in the film industry, the idea of diversity in the media industry is such an important topic for me. As COVID-19 has given the world the opportunity to sit down and view things with a clear pair of eyes, so too has the fight for diversity and equity in the workplace and world come to the forefront. It is prominent that the white identifying males in the age ranges of 30 to 70 years old are dominating the film and television entertainment workforce, as is noticeable across all aspects of production. In recent discoveries, it was found that both women and people of color are still considered underrepresented in every single category of industry employment, ranging from film leads to directors to broadcast and scripted TV. But this still calls into question, years down the line when society refers to us as the liberal and open-minded generation, why is this still happening, and what can we do to make it better? Those college-age millennials that I'm accessing for my research are tied to the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York, one of the top communications institutions in the United States. Those interviewed range from the ages of 18 to 25 years old and come from a wide variety of ethnic backgrounds, representing both the majority and the minority voices. Given the current circumstances of the world riddled and broken by the pandemic and a state of recovery, I would have loved to be able to assess a greater sample in terms of my population. However, because of COVID-19 and general accessibility, I had to keep things small and in my general circle of networking to carry out several research methodologies. Looking closer at the several research methods employed in this study, my expected outcomes, as mentioned earlier, were proven to be true in nature. You can even note a trickle-down effect from previous generations to the current generation of up-and-coming media industry professionals.
So there you can see a quick sample of some of the work that's coming out of the classrooms at the Herbert School. And we welcome more of your participation and take some of our classes if you're not already taking them. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody who organized. We'll see you soon.